problem of scarcity really results from a supply and demand imbalance. And so what I mean by that is, for the most part, all of our natural supply of water comes from the sky. It comes down as rain or snow, and that's the replenishment of our available water sources, our rivers, our lakes, our groundwater aquifers. And if we start pulling water out of those water sources faster than the rate at which they're being replenished, then we end up with a scarcity problem. We end up with having water shortages. Turns out that those water shortages and scarcity problems are showing up in about a third of all the river basins and lakes and aquifers around the world. And so there's a lot of people, about half of the human population is dealing with water shortages now on a recurring or a chronic basis. Well, I think to really approach water management from a sustainable perspective, we really need to think about how much of the water is available for our use on a reliable basis over the long term, or even during drought conditions. And then also think about how much water might we want to leave within the natural systems to support a lot of other values and benefits that we as a society derive. For instance, we depend upon fisheries that are very much concentrated along coastal areas, oftentimes in estuaries. And so we want to make sure that there's enough water flowing downstream through our river systems in order to support some of those natural ecosystem benefits and values that we depend upon. So it's a key part of a sustainable water management plan involves that determination of how much water is available from year to year, accounting for the fact that there's much less in some years than others, and how much water we want to leave within the natural systems, and then how are we going to allocate or manage that portion of the water that we want to make available for all sorts of human uses, for farming and for use in our cities and for other purposes. And that requires both good planning, it requires good science, it requires good technical analysis, but then it also requires really strong implementation and enforcement, because we need to set rules about who gets to use water, how much water they get to use, during what times of year do they get to use it, for what purposes. And once we have set those allocation rules, then we need to be able to monitor whether everybody's paying attention to the rules and abiding by the rules. And when they're not, there needs to be some enforcement mechanism. So a really high-functioning water management system involves all of those elements. And when you have those elements in place, we can manage our water supplies in a sustainable manner and ensure that we all have a secure water future. One of the interesting things that we have found in our research, we do a lot of analysis of all the different water sources distributed all around the planet. And we keep track of the water conditions there. We keep track of the water conditions from year to year, even month to month. And we pay attention to which communities in different parts of the world are approaching the limits of their available water supply. And what we have found, interestingly, is that about 2/3 of all the rivers, lakes, and aquifers on the planet are being pretty lightly used. We're really only consuming about 10% of the water on average that's being naturally replenished by rainfall and snowfall. But the other 1/3 of these water sources are being very, very heavily utilized. They're being exploited to a very full extent, and in fact, in some places, the communities are actually using more water than is being replenished on average every year. Well, how do they do that? Well, first they dry up the surface water, they dry up the rivers, they may dry down the lakes, and then they start going after the water that's stored underground in the groundwater aquifers. And they start to pump that water out. And it's like raiding a savings account, because once you have to go into that stored water underground and rely upon it on an ongoing basis, then you're really getting yourself into a lot of trouble, because that water is eventually going to get to be so deep, we're going to lower that water level so much from extracting so much out of it that we're no longer going to be able to reach it, or it's going to become too expensive to be able to pull it up to the ground surface because of how much electricity it requires to be able to pump that water out of deep areas in the ground. Now, We've used a lot of different approaches to try to change our supply and demand balance. Most of those approaches have been focused on trying to increase our water supplies. Well, how do we do that? Well, we can build reservoirs, which don't technically increase the supply of water, but they may capture some of the water that's flowing downstream in a river and hold on to it for a while so that we can make use of it before it passes on downstream and goes on out to the ocean. So we can temporarily hold it back and make that available for our use. But the important thing to understand is that that doesn't actually create more water, it just holds on to the water temporarily to make it available for us to use. Other ways that we've increased our local water supplies is once we've depleted our local water supply, then we reach into other distant watersheds or aquifers. We build pipelines and canals to be able to bring water into our local area because we don't have enough water in our local area to be able to support our demands. Now, that has been a successful strategy in many places in the world, and in fact, about 40% of all the water that's supplied to the world's major cities comes from in that way. It comes from those cities reaching out at far distant areas and bringing water in from surrounding water sources. The problem is that in the water scarce regions of the world, in the places that are starting to bump up against the limits of their available water supply, there is no more surplus water, even next door, even at some distance. And so we're having to reach further and further away. A good example of this is the Chinese. They're just completing the first phase of a long distance water transfer project that they call the South-North Water Diversion Project. This project takes water out of the Yangtze River system in the southern part of China, and it transports that water over 1,000 kilometers to areas in the northern part of China that have exhausted their local water supplies. That includes the capital city of Beijing. It includes the North China Plain, which is the breadbasket of China. And those places have run out of their local water, so they've invested in this huge water transfer project. The problem with that is that it's very, very costly to build a big infrastructure project like that. It takes a tremendous amount of energy to be able to move that water over that long of a distance, and that comes at great cost, and you can't afford that water for many purposes. And then also it also puts a lot of pressure on these areas in the southern part of the country that eventually are also going to have water scarcity problems themselves if they continue to take so much water out of the wetter southern areas and transport it to the north. So these aren't strategies that are going to serve us very well as we go forward in the 21st century. There's one other technology that I want to mention that is being looked at as a potential silver bullet, and that's what we call desalination. Desalination means basically desalting, taking the salt out of salty water like the ocean or out of salty underground water that's stored in groundwater aquifers, running it through a technological process called desalination and turning it into fresh water. Now, that sounds like a wonderful way to bolster our water supplies, and it is. Under certain circumstances, when most of your other options are no longer available, it can really be a lifesaver in terms of water supply. And so a lot of coastal cities are turning to this as a means of supplementing their natural water supplies. Now again, the challenge with desalination is one, it's extremely energy intensive, which means that it's very expensive. And so we're really not using desalination for lower value uses such as irrigating a lot of crops. We use it primarily for industrial water supplies or for urban water supplies where the users of that water can afford to pay the large cost, the big cost of that water. And how much is that big cost? Well, it can be 10 times or more expensive than other ways of accessing water, such as diverting water from a local river or pumping water from a local groundwater aquifer. Desalination presently accounts for only about 1% to 2% of the total water use in the world presently. Much of that desalination is taking place in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has built more than 30 large desalination plants. And understandably, the Saudis don't have a lot of other options. They don't have perennial rivers flowing across the surface of that country. And they have been very dependent upon their groundwater aquifers, but they realized that they were pumping their groundwater aquifers so fast that that wasn't going to be a long-term solution as well. They were seeing that they were no longer going to be able to pump groundwater literally in the next few decades. And so they had to turn to something else. They didn't have any other options. And so desalination makes sense in a country like Saudi Arabia that has run out of its other options. Now, interestingly, the Saudis are starting to build desalination plants that run entirely on solar energy. And if they can get the cost of their energy production using solar down to a reasonable level, that water may become more and more affordable and therefore useful for a lot of different things that the Saudis are dependent upon for their water supplies. There are a lot of coastal cities that are now investing in the technology of desalination, particularly coastal cities where you have a large major city and for various reasons they are bumping up against the limits of their local water supplies. It may no longer be affordable or available to them to import water from further inland areas. And so now they're taking a serious look at whether or not they can turn ocean water into fresh water. And that makes a lot of sense for many cities. Obviously the ocean is an abundant source of water, virtually limitless from the standpoint of our needs for water. And I think for a lot of these coastal cities, this is probably going to be the next best option. Now, there's a couple of caveats to that, though. One is that a lot of these cities, when they start to really look hard at the cost of desalination, which can be very high because it requires so much energy, and a lot of these cities are starting to realize that there may be other ways, at least in the near term, over the next couple of decades, to, instead of trying to bolster their water supplies, maybe switching to a very different strategy, and that is to lower their need, to lower their demand for water. And so we're seeing a number of very progressive cities now that are really doubling down on water conservation measures. And so they're doing all sorts of things to try to use less water within the cities. One of the most important things they can do is to change how much water they're using out in outdoor landscaping. So they're changing the vegetation, the plants, the lawns that they're using, and going to outdoor landscaping that's more adapted, more appropriate for their local climate. In fact, that much of which may require no supplemental irrigation at all and can thrive on the natural rainfall that's available to those plants. There are other things that they can do with switching out the plumbing fixtures in homes and in businesses to utilize more efficient toilets, more efficient washing machines, more efficient dishwashers, and overall just use a lot less water. There is potential for cities to use easily 25 to 50% less water, and that can be a really smart strategy in many, many ways because it's much more cost effective and it's also much less environmentally damaging because you're not having to go to other sources, new sources of water, and further depleting those sources to a greater extent, and perhaps not having to utilize the technologies like desalination, which require a lot of energy, which has a lot of spin-off environmental consequences, such as the production of carbon emissions in the production of that energy. Those carbon emissions, of course, are having a bad effect on changing our climate. So in my consulting and advising to cities all around the world, I'm quite emphatic about the need to, first and foremost, invest as heavily as you can in trying to be more water conservative, more water efficient. That is the most sensible, cost-effective next means of water supply. And then only after you've exhausted the potential of water conservation, then should you go to other strategies to try to bolster your water supplies. A few years ago, I was having a conversation with my father. My father lives in San Diego, California, And he's always trying to engage me in conversation about water, and wants to learn as much as he can from me about water. And he's quite frustrated and perplexed about the fact that in San Diego, as well as in many other cities within California, and in fact, many other cities around the world, in fact, about half of all cities in the world are now facing water shortage challenges. So he's not alone. But one of the questions that he asked me, he said, "Brian, it seems to me that we need to stop letting all of that water run out to the ocean." He said, "If we could just capture that water, if we could just build some more reservoirs and let that water waste out to the ocean, that seemed to him to be a very sensible thing to do." And what I tried to explain to him was that water on its way to the ocean, and once it reaches the ocean, actually provides a lot of services and a lot of values that a lot of us don't understand, and therefore we take it for granted, or we think that it's not serving, any value to us. And so specifically, as the water's flowing down our rivers, it's providing habitat for a lot of other species that depend upon those types of freshwater ecosystems. It supports tremendous bird life and frogs and fish. And in fact, we enjoy a lot of those values and a lot of that wildlife. We fish for it, we go bird watching. It's a pleasure to be able to walk within our cities, to have cool, shady places where trees line river systems, and we can go for a nice hike and find shade on a hot summer day. And so there's a lot of reasons why we depend upon these park-like settings for our recreation and for other values. And then once that water flows downstream, a lot of it moves into coastal estuaries, places where fresh water mixes with ocean water. And it turns out those estuaries are among the most productive ecosystems on our planet. They are biological engines that produce much of the fish and shellfish that we then subsequently depend upon for our food supply. And in fact, if we cut off all of that fresh water that's moving down our rivers and getting into the areas, the coastal areas and these estuaries, we would really damage a lot of our food security. We would really reduce the food supply that those processes of freshwater inflow to the coast are providing to us. And so we need to be really aware of, knowledgeable about these ecological processes, these biological processes, when we're making decisions about where we should go to capture the next buckets of water that we're going to need to use on our farms or in our cities. One thing I will say about the use of reservoirs, and that they can be very useful, and they can be used in ways that are as least damaging to the natural environment as possible. There's certainly, I think most environmental scientists would agree that there is some volume of water, particularly water that comes gushing off of our landscape during big floods, that is running down the rivers and rushing out to the ocean. And it most definitely is possible to pull some of that water, some of that flood water off of the river flow, capture it in reservoirs, or perhaps capture it and pump it in underground and store it in underground aquifers and make that available for future human use. So there really is a way to utilize infrastructure like reservoirs in a very sensible way that does the least possible environmental damage, that can be cost effective, and can bolster our water supplies. So I think the two big challenges that we face, to be simplistic and perhaps at the risk of oversimplifying, with our management of water, is to first determine how much water we can remove from any water source, from any river, lake, or groundwater aquifer, and how much water we actually need to leave alone to support the natural ecological systems and the food supplies that those natural ecological systems provide us, and the recreational benefits that we derive from those systems. So there's a portion of the water that we need to think about reserving from use, that we need to just leave it in place in the natural ecosystems flowing downstream in the lakes and what have you. And then for that other portion of the water that's available and being naturally replenished by the rain and snow year after year, then we have to get smart about what's the best use of that portion of the water supply. And in thinking about that, we certainly need to think about the need to make sure that everybody has adequate access to fresh, clean drinking water supplies for their basic human needs, for their cooking, their showering, for perhaps the growing of their gardens to provide their subsistence food supplies. We need to make sure that we're taking some portion of the available water from every water source and making sure that everybody has affordable, ready, safe access to their basic water needs. But then what are we going to do with the rest of the water? Well, we haven't been very thoughtful about that. And in fact, a lot of the water that is available to us, we've been using in fairly wasteful ways. We've been using it in ways that perhaps aren't very efficient, that perhaps aren't the smartest way to use the water from an economic perspective. And unfortunately, many of our water management or water allocation systems are so archaic and so rigid and so difficult to change that we end up with people continuing to use water in wasteful ways or in ways that don't generate a lot of economic value, and yet there is no way to change the way that water is being used. There's no way for us to, for instance, trade the rights to use that water, for us to be able to better share that water that's available. And so there's a lot of talk now in places like California and the Colorado River Basin, throughout the American West, in many other places in the world, in Australia and Chile, that are running out of water supply, that they've tried to allow some water to be left in the environment, but they're realizing that the way that they have been using the rest of the water is inefficient, wasteful, and not very productive. And so they're starting to think about how do we make some of that water that could be used more efficiently, more effectively, more economically productive. How can we find ways to share that water among users to make optimal use, optimal economic and social and cultural use of that water? So a lot of these places are starting to think about this concept of water markets. So water markets are based on the idea that once you've created a system where you've determined the rights for individuals or businesses or water utilities to use a certain volume of water, can you also create a system where you can reward some of those individuals who have water rights to find ways to use less water, to become more efficient, more conservative with the water that they've been granted, and in return, make some portion of that water available to other water users that are in need of more water. And what's great about this is that those other users are willing to financially compensate some of those other water users for trading some of their water that they no longer need. And so these systems, these water market systems, open up the ability to trade, and they incentivize using water in a more conservative, more efficient way. So what I mean by that is, if you can be rewarded by saving water because somebody else is going to pay you to be able to use that saved water, that becomes a very powerful driver for water conservation and water efficiency. And so what you see in these places in the world that have moved to highly functioning, effective water market systems is that people are using water in a much more efficient, more conservative, economically productive way, and that optimizes things for everybody. And so you see everybody benefiting from that, more revenue being generated, more jobs being created, and fewer people being cut short of the water that they really need. So one of the best examples of a high-functioning water market system, in fact, unfortunately, one of the only examples existing in the world presently, can be found in Australia. The Australians went through a horrendous drought that they called the Millennium Drought or the Big Dry that lasted from about 1997 until about 2009. During that time period, the rainfall dropped to unprecedented levels. They had half or only 40% of the water that they were accustomed to having and using on average. And this caused horrendous problems for many Australians, both those living in the cities as well as farmers. Many farmers went out of business. They just simply didn't have enough water to grow their crops. They didn't have enough water to grow the feed necessary to feed their livestock. And so it created really serious problems socially and economically throughout much of particularly the west and the southeastern part, the eastern and the southeastern part of Australia. And so they first started to learn how they could use less water. Everybody tried to get by with using less water. But then they also realized if they could share water better, that could have a lot of benefits. So they changed a lot of the rules about how you could use your water rights, your water entitlements. And they created the opportunity for water entitlement holders to save some portion of their water and then make it available to other water rights holders that just simply didn't have enough entitlement to water to meet their needs. And so they started trading water. And all of a sudden, in the last 10 years in particular, on average, they're now trading 40% of the water that gets used in places like the Murray-Darling River Basin in southeastern Australia. 40% of the water being used each year is getting traded in this water market system. And so the farmers in the towns have gotten to be really smart about, in each year, am I going to have enough water in my water entitlement to get me through? Or am I actually going to have more water than I might need? And could I make some of that surplus water available to other users and become financially compensated for that? So what we like to say is the farmers in particular are learning to use less water to grow their crops. And so they're producing crops, but at the same time now, they're growing water. They're actually producing water that they can become available to others because they no longer need it, because they're becoming more efficient with the way that they irrigate their crops. And so it's a very important way to create opportunities when you don't have a lot of other water options, when it's too expensive to build new infrastructure, when you've exhausted a lot of other possibilities for meeting your water supply needs. The institution of a water market and creating these opportunities for trade and rewarding people that can use less water has proven to be a very, very promising way to get your way out of a water shortage or out of a water scarcity problem. Some of the most difficult water challenges are in settings where there are multiple jurisdictions that are sharing the same water supply. Now, this might mean places where multiple states share the same river. The Colorado River Basin that flows through the American West is a great example of this, shared by 7 states. But there are many, many river basins around the world where multiple countries actually share the same water supply, the same river. Sometimes even underground aquifers are spread across, reach across multiple states, boundaries, or multiple countries even. And so the challenges of trying to come up with agreements about how to equitably and fairly share that water between different jurisdictions is really, really difficult. Now, historically, problems arose, particularly in river systems, because the upstream state or the upstream country used as much water as they could, even to the point of maybe completely drying up the river and preventing it from flowing downstream across the state line or across the international boundary. This is very much the case, for example, with the United States, and that we use so much of the Colorado River's water before it crosses the boundary into Mexico, and Mexico raises its hand and says, hey, what about us? You know, we're rightfully entitled to use some of the portion of that Colorado River as well. The same is true about the Rio Grande River that is shared between the United States and Mexico. But again, it's true about rivers around the world that are shared by multiple countries. And so over time, what we're seeing is these political jurisdictions trying to work this out and trying to come up with agreements. I think one of the best illustrations of this and the difficulties of this is what went on in the Colorado River in the American West. So as more and more population was moving into the American West, as more and more farms were being developed and requiring irrigation from the Colorado River, some of the leading civic minds of the time started to realize that this wasn't a resource that was going to be limitless, that was going to be boundless in its available water supply. Some of the lower states in the Colorado River Basin, like Arizona and California and Nevada, started to think, you know, as those states in the upper basin, as Colorado and Wyoming and Utah start to utilize more and more of the water supply in the upper part of this river system, we could be vulnerable downstream. It might be smart for us to all get together and try to work out a water sharing agreement. And they did that back in 1922. Representatives from each of the 7 states that share the Colorado River got together in northern New Mexico, outside of Santa Fe, New Mexico, in a place called Bishop's Lodge, and they tried to work it out. And they worked it out over the course of days and weeks, and they came up with what was called the Colorado River Compact, also called the Law of the River. And that compact divided up the water supply in the Colorado River system. Now, some of the states got a bigger chunk of that water pie than others. Some states like California were more populated and growing faster and had more political clout, and so they came in and they got a bigger chunk than, say, Nevada, which was relatively undeveloped at that time. But one of the most important tenets that the architects of the Colorado River Compact came up with was they recognized a split between what they called the upper basin states and the lower basin states. And the dividing line was a place called Lee's Ferry, which is now the location of Lake Powell on the Colorado River. And so the states that were upstream of Lake Powell were called the upper basin states, and the states downstream of Lake Powell, which is dammed by Glen Canyon Dam, they were called the lower basin states. And the architects of the compact figured that, based on the measurements of the river at that time, that there was about 16.5 million acre feet of water available on average in the overall Colorado River system. Now, an acre feet, for those of you that aren't familiar with that term, it's a volume of water used in water supply allocation in the United States. And it's the volume of water that it would take to cover 1 acre of land to 1 foot of depth. That's an acre foot of water. And so when they were dividing up the water of the Colorado River, they thought there was 16.5 million acre feet of water to divvy up. So the architects said the upper basin states are going to get close to half of that. They're going to get 7.5 million acre feet. We're going to give 7.5 million acre feet to the lower basin states. And we're going to leave 1.5 million because there's some other things we're going to have to address, like, for example, Mexico at the downstream end of the system. Even though Mexico wasn't a part of that compact negotiation, the architects of the compact knew that they were going to have to share some of the water with Mexico. So there was 1.5 million acre feet that was left in reserve. Well, tragically, as we've now come to understand, the measurements of the available water available at that time grossly overestimated how much water was available in the Colorado River system. In fact, those measurements we now understand that those measurements were taken from a time period that we now know to be among the wettest 20-year period in the last 500 years. And so now we've had to deal with the problem that we grossly overallocated the water in the Colorado River system. We gave too much rights to that water away, given what we now know to be available on average. And in fact, in some years, when we have droughts, like the current drought that we're in the American West, there's much less than that amount of water available. And so this is creating all kinds of problems in the Colorado River system. Each of the states is getting to the point where they're fully utilizing, fully consuming the water that they were entitled to. And in fact, they were using more than the available water supply presently during the drought. So that comes to roost. The best indication of the fact that we're using more water than is naturally available is when you look at the levels of the reservoirs in Lake Powell, dammed by Glen Canyon Dam, and downstream in Lake Mead, which is dammed by Hoover Dam. When you look at the water levels over the last 10 years in those two reservoirs, you see a frightening decline in those water levels. The water levels are dropping year by year by year. And so in essence, what that tells us is the water being used by the 7 states that share the Colorado River are using more water, and they are overusing the amount of water available because their bank account, the reservoir water stored in those 2 lakes, is going down. It's like watching your savings account going down year after year. This is going to have some very serious consequences, and already is starting to have some consequences. As the water level, particularly in Lake Mead, gets down to a certain level, then certain states start to have their allocation of the Colorado River cut back. Arizona is the first to be cut back. Their allocation of their rights to the Colorado River is going to be dialed back. That's going to have some very challenging consequences, particularly if the drought lasts for a much longer time and they have to deal with those cutbacks for years or decades into the future. Nevada would be the next state to really feel the pain. But eventually all of these states are going to have to grapple with having, if they have less water supply available than what they've been allocated and what they've become accustomed to using. And so this is a really an interesting case study of how difficult it is to understand how much water is available, how much water can be allocated, how much water might we want to leave available for other purposes like sustaining our natural ecosystems, and what's fair to allocate among the different political jurisdictions, and how do we do that in a way that is going to be reliable and provide us with some certainty even in the drought years. This is proving to be a great challenge in many, many different river basins and in many different shared aquifers all around the world. As communities across the American West and around the world are bumping up against the limits of their available water supply, everybody's feeling very anxious, feeling very urgent about what are we going to do about this problem. And a lot of the options that were available to us in the 20th century are no longer available to us. In particular, when a community or when a farming area runs out of water, we can no longer build pipelines and canals to reach into far distant water sources, because those far distant water sources are experiencing the same problems. And in fact, the communities that are dependent upon those other watersheds and those other groundwater aquifers are saying, heck no, you can't take our water. We're going to need that water for ourselves and for our water future. And so you cannot have this water. And so we're really coming up against the realities that water has real limits. And there are real limits to what we can afford to do, what kind of infrastructure we can build, whether we can produce water using new technologies. We're really bumping up against those limits. And so what then are we going to do? And the real answer here is we need to do 2 things, and we need to do them very, very quickly. And governments and businesses and private citizens all need to get on board with this. First and foremost, we need to turn into becoming a water-saving society. We need to start using much less water to do much more with it, to produce much more crops using less water, to be able to enable our cities to grow while at the same time using less water. That can be done, I assure you. This is not a pipe dream. This is not an aspirational thing. There are many places in the world where this has been proven to be feasible to do, that communities and farmers have been able to achieve these things. But we need to be able to apply those things at a much greater scale and in a much more comprehensive way. Now, how do we get there? How do we drive that activity? We need to, what we have learned is that most people don't respond very favorably to being told what to do. If you tell them we're going to cut off your water by 20 or 30%, they don't react in very favorable ways typically, and that's understandable human nature. There's a grand experiment taking place along those effects in Australia in the Murray-Darling Basin, where the federal officials said, and that water is being used in the Murray-Darling Basin primarily by farmers, and the federal government said, you're going to use 20% less water than you become accustomed to using. Now, in their defense, the federal government tried to soften that blow by saying, and we're going to invest very heavily in trying to help you use less water. For those of you who can spare some water, we'll just reduce your consumption by buying that water from you. We're going to pay you to reduce your water entitlement voluntarily. And they were able to recover a lot of water, to take some portion of that necessary 20% reduction down by buying water from people who just simply didn't need as much water as they were entitled to. They're using the rest of the money made available by the federal government to help the farmers invest in water-saving measures, to become more efficient with their water use, to use less water on their farms, to improve the way that they transport and deliver the water using their canals and their irrigation systems, and that's how they're going to get to their 20% reduction. But the fact that they started by telling the farmers, you're going to have to use 20% less, did not sit well with the farmers. In fact, there's still a lot of disgruntlement, there's still a lot of hostility in those farming communities because they started by being told what to do. So, the lesson learned there is that we need to think about other ways to tell people or to help people use a lot less water. We need to incentivize them if at all possible. A great example of that are things like the city of Las Vegas. They realized that they were bumping up against the limits of their water supply because, again, the Colorado River system is over-allocated, everybody's fighting over their share of the water supply. The state of Nevada and the city of Las Vegas was feeling that pinch, and so the water managers in Las Vegas did a number of smart things, and one of the things that they did was they created a cash for grass program where they paid residential homeowners to remove their lawns. And this was enormously successful. They saw people ripping out their lawns, they were paying them enough. It was something like $1 per square foot of lawn, and they had a lot of takers. They had a lot of people, even fairly wealthy homeowners, that saw that as an opportunity to make some quick cash. They pulled out their lawns and they replaced it with more natural vegetation that could be supported on the rain that's available or with very little irrigation supply. Over the last decade, Las Vegas has been able to drop its water use by a third by using things like their Cash for Grass program and other programs that enabled that city to lower their water use. So that's a great example of using an incentive to get at getting people to use less water. You can also use disincentives, and what I mean by that is charging people more for their water. It's been used very successfully by a lot of cities who particularly use what's called a block rate pricing system, where in the interest of making water affordable for everybody, the first block of water, maybe the first 1,000 gallons that you use each month, is at a fairly low rate, so that even the poorer families in the community are able to afford that water. But as you move against that, up above that first block, as you use more than that first block, then you start to pay for it. You start to pay a good increase in the price for those next blocks of water. And so the people who in the community who are relatively well off, they're wealthy individuals or wealthy families, they may not mind paying for more and more water, and they can go on using water in the way that they want. But what we're finding is that many families, most of the families in these communities, if you set those prices at the right level, are going to respond very quickly and use a lot less water. My family in San Diego is a great example of this. And the San Diego water managers got to be very smart and very effective in the way that they set the prices on their charges, their monthly charges for water. And my parents saw that how much of their water was going to their outdoor lawn. They had a green grass lawn and shrubs that required a lot of water. And they made the decision to convert their lawns. They ripped out their lawns. They went to other, in essence, artificial lawn in part of their yard. They went to other vegetation, other shrubs in other parts of the yard, and they were able to greatly reduce their monthly water bills. And so to them, it wasn't necessarily about the environment or about water conservation or doing good for the planet. It was about their monthly water bill. And the monthly water bill can be a very effective way to adjust behaviors and water use within a community. The same could happen out in farming communities as well. If we charged a little bit more, farmers would start being more careful with the water that they use and lower their overall water use. So I've just covered one of two major ways that we can use that's important for dealing with a water shortage crisis, and that is being more conservative and using less water. The other really important strategy is to find ways to share water. So given you have a limited water supply available to you, within a water user community, there are always some water users that don't have enough water, don't have entitlements or rights to enough water, and you have other members in the community that have been pretty lax about the way that they use water. And in fact, they could actually use less water, but they keep on going using that full allocation of their water because they're entitled to it. They have no incentive to use less water or to make that water available to their neighbors or to others who are within their water user community that are needing more water. Well, how do we fix that problem? Well, we create rules or we relax restrictions to enable people to share water better, to trade their water entitlements in a more fluent way, in a more active way. And so you create what we refer to as a water market, where if somebody has more entitlement to water than they need to use, they can make that available to other waters and be rewarded financially for that. Other water users can purchase that portion of the water right that somebody else may no longer need, or just maybe a surplus to certain water users. And so you start to see this water trading happen, and what you start to see is a much more optimal use of the limited water supply that is available, and you start to see people using it in a much smarter way. On average, they're making more money from the water. There are more jobs being created through the use of the water. And over time, the value of that water goes up. People respect that value more. They're more careful with it. And it's a more optimal use of the water. And so everybody ends up benefiting from it, from that creation of that water market system. So again, the two most important things that I strongly and emphatically recommend to communities and farmers that are running short on water supply is, first, invest as heavily as possible and use incentives and disincentives to get there to use the least possible volume of water that you can. And then second, set up systems where you can trade the rights to use water so that you can optimize the use of the limited water supplies. So I'm often asked, where are there good examples of states or countries around the world that I would hold up as being the best in the way that they use water? And I guess I would say that my first choice, I guess my blue ribbon would probably go to the country of Israel. But I will also say that that comes with some caveats. Now, first, the reason I think Israel deserves a blue ribbon is that they use water very, very carefully. It's a very dry country. And so over time, they have figured out how to use water as efficiently as possible. In the cities, in the homes, in the businesses, They are as thrifty with water use as any communities you'll find anywhere in the world. They use water efficient appliances. Their outdoor landscaping is largely supported just by the rain that falls naturally. They apply very little water, irrigation water outside. And so their urban areas are as water efficient as they can get. Same thing is true out in their irrigated agricultural areas. The farmers have learned to use highly efficient irrigation methods like drip irrigation, using plastic tubing to apply water very carefully, very strategically, directly to the root systems of each individual plant. And so they've minimized the amount of water that they need to use out in irrigated agriculture. Now, they've also invested in a couple of other technologies that help to stretch their water supplies as far as possible. Their natural water supply comes predominantly from the Jordan River. They take a lot of water up the upper end of the Jordan River and they bring it over to their coastal cities and to their irrigated agricultural areas historically that came out of the Jordan River. But over time they realized that they were using as much of the Jordan River and in fact drying up the Jordan River. And so they saw the limit of their natural water supply. And so they had to move to other methods. And the Saudis then they began investing very heavily in the technology of desalination. Of course, the ocean is immediately offshore, and so they started building some large desalination plants, a technology that could take the ocean water and transform it into fresh water. And that was a smart investment for the Israeli cities because the Israeli cities are fairly wealthy comparatively. Desalination can be an expensive technology. It can cause the cost of the water to be fairly high, but people living in Israeli cities could afford to pay that cost. And so it made sense for them to go to desalination as a way of meeting the urban water supply. Then the next smart thing that they did was they said, well, instead of forcing our farmers to pump the groundwater aquifers dry, we're going to allow them to use the recycled wastewater from our cities. And so the cities are being supplied with desalinated ocean water. And then instead of taking their wastewater after they've used the water in the cities and sending it back out to the ocean, they send that water out to the irrigated farms. And so they're reusing that water. Now, that water has been processed, treated after the Israeli cities have used it. So it's good, clean water. It's at least clean enough to be perfectly safe to use for irrigation in agriculture. And that's how they now meet the irrigation needs of the cities. Now, I said that there are two caveats to the blue ribbon that I would give to Israel for their water supply. On one hand, it looks like they're meeting their water supply in a sustainable manner, but I would say there's two things that they still need to continue to work on. One is that desalination is being supported with a lot of energy that comes from power plants that are emitting a lot of carbon. Coal-fired power plants or gas-fired power plants that are emitting a lot of carbon, and that's not good for our climate. Of course, carbon emissions are the reason why our climate is changing. And by building desalination plants and using power sources that emit a lot of carbon emissions is not a smart thing. And so the Israelis really need to give serious consideration to moving to more renewable sources of energy supply. And in particular, they have an abundance of solar energy in that country, and they should look to the lead that the Saudi Arabians have taken and start investing in powering those desalination plants with solar energy. So that's the first thing that I think to really to keep their blue ribbon, I think the Israelis need to invest in solar desalination to the greatest extent possible. The other point that I will make is that the Israelis have completely tapped their natural water supply, which is the Jordan River, And along with the Jordanians and the Palestinians, that Jordan River now runs completely dry. The only water that trickles down the Jordan River today is water that has run off of agricultural fields. It's loaded with chemicals, nutrients, and salts. And frankly, it's a pretty putrid little stream, and only a trickle of water still flowing in the Jordan River. That's done great damage to the natural habitats that were supported by the Jordan River. And by the way, the Jordan River, it was one of the most important migratory stopovers for this massive migration of birds that comes out of Africa, out of northern Africa, and moves toward the north. And some of those birds end up in the far reaches of northern Europe, and with the loss of that habitat along the Jordan River, it's caused great problems for migratory waterfowl and for a lot of other wildlife that was dependent upon the Jordan River. Additionally, because the Jordan River no longer flows downstream into the Dead Sea, the Dead Sea has been dropping year after year by about a meter on average, and that's causing all kinds of problems in the Dead Sea. There are a lot of people, villages, and resorts on both sides, both the Jordanian side and the Israeli side of the Dead Sea. Those villages, those resorts are now left high and dry as the lakeshore of the Dead Sea has receded. As the water level drops, the lakeshore moves and recedes, and now a lot of those places now look at the border or the lakeshore of the Dead Sea kilometers away from where it used to be. So the second point that I would encourage the Israelis to pay close attention to is our next challenge is to bring the Jordan River back to life and use that to restore the levels of the Dead Sea while you're meeting all of the water supply needs for your cities and your farms. And then you'll truly have the blue ribbon that you deserve for being the most sustainable water users on the planet.